and I'll be able to see. Right now it's just showing my screen. Okay, so can you hear me? Can you hear me? Testing, testing. Aloha, everyone. Can you guys hear me? All right, it says I have 4 viewers. If you folks can hear me, can you type something in the chat to let me know? Oh, okay, good to know. This is Anna on the phone, by the way. Okay. Hooray, Anna. Okay, I think we can hang up on here. We're good. Okay, cool. Cool. Talk to you in a bit. Yes, mahalo everyone for being patient with me. I've never felt so tech illiterate. Okay, so I think we should step right into this presentation because we're kind of a little bit late. But okay, let's go into this. So again, this is my first time doing live. Mahalo for your guys' patience. What else do I want to say? I can't see your guys' comments right away. I might open up maybe my phone so I can see your folks' comments. And Anna, if you want to maybe text me and, oh, you should look at the chat. Let me know if there's something I should look at. But this is a pretty short presentation, and I'm hoping to open it up to more discussion-based at the end of maybe after 30 minutes or so. So today's talk has been called Culture, Traditional Knowledge, and Biodiversity. My name is Noah Ha'alilio Solomon. It is Akua, in the month of Ikua, the Hawaiian way of measuring time. And this day and this month is Akua in the month of Ikua. Also, we might just say it's October 30th. I'm going to test my volume before I start. Anna just said I should speak a little bit louder, so I hope this is okay. If you folks can hear me, if you can't hear me, let me know. I want to start by saying mahalo to Anna, Bilu, Zach Brenneman, and Shirley Gabber, as well as everybody at the Language Documentation Training Center and the Linguistics Department at UH Manoa for having me. This is the 3rd time I've done this talk. The first time on the Facebook Live. Actually, the first time we ever did this talk was in person, of course, back before COVID was even something in our imagination, ancient times. And we did this, it was actually a biocultural walking tour, and that was really fun. I got to meet members of LDTC as well as fellow linguists in our department and a few other individuals. And what we did is walked around to certain spots on campus where I knew we could find some native plants. And we just talked about how those native plants fit into the history and the current day here in Hawaii, as well as some linguistic implications of those plants. So that's kind of what I want to do today, but I'm framing it a little bit differently. I'm sure we have all heard how much language and culture are both intimately intertwined with one another. A particular language usually points out to a specific group of people. When you interact with another language, it means that you are also interacting with the culture that speaks the language. You cannot understand one's culture without accessing its language directly. I think this is a really important starting point into talking about language documentation. I myself work closely with Olelo Hawaii. I consider it a heritage language of mine. I'm not a native speaker of Hawaiian language, but I work with it. I teach Hawaiian language in Kawaihuelani Center for Hawaiian Language at UH Manoa. And I'm also a translator with Awaiulu for Hawaiian language primary source material. So I work with Hawaiian language every day. In the linguistics department, I am currently in my 3rd year of the PhD program. And my dissertation topic is looking at language ideologies and attitudes surrounding Olelo Hawaii. That's my positionality in how I'm approaching today's topic and this talk. And so I want to emphasize these sort of main points in the project of language documentation and conservation. Of course, it's always important to understand the interconnectedness of language and culture. Also to recognize the importance of culture and tradition, as well as cultural and traditional knowledge. We want to also recognize the biodiversity that exists between cultures and languages, while we strive to document and conserve cultural, traditional, and ecological knowledge systems. So instead of professing that I looked up I looked up and I'm well versed in the latest, most updated definition of what is culture and what is cultural knowledge and what is tradition and what is traditional knowledge and what is biodiversity. Instead of doing that, I kind of want to show you folks. So today I picked out a few examples of Hawaiian plants, a Hawaiian bird. But we're going to start off with this video that Danny Yarborough, she's a fellow PhD student, a good friend of mine. She and I collaborate pretty often on different linguistic related projects. And we made this Mo'olelo Oiwi. It's a animated video that takes the script of a traditional Hawaiian mo'olelo or Hawaiian story. You might call it a sort of children's story, a folk tale, even though that kind of has some baggage around the term. But it is a traditional story, a mo'olelo oiwi, and it's not very long. I'm hoping we can watch it. I might. It's only about three minutes. So I wanted to open up with just a screening of this animation, if that's okay. And I'm hoping it'll play.
I ka wā kahiko, o noho ke kahi iole me kona ohana, ma ka moku punu o moko li'i. O ke kahi lā, ma ke make oia e hele aku I kane ohe. Ua loa'a iaia he wa'a, ka hoe pula oia I kualoa. I kona hiki ana mai, ua ho'opa'a ia ka wa'a ma ke kumuniu, a hele kula ka iole I kane ohe. Aka, a'ole I ho'opa'a pono ia ka wa'a. No laila, I kona hiki ana mai kane ohe mai, ua lilo ka wa'a I ke kai. Ka pilikia nui. Ua noho I hola ka iole a we me ka leo nui loa. Ua lohe ia kona we ana, e ke kahi he'e loko mai kai. Ni nao kula ka he'e iaia.
Ini, e hako pilikia?
A pani mai ka iole.
Ua nala wale ko wa'a. Ua lilo paha I ke kai. No ka mea, a ole paha mai kai ko ho'opa'a ana. A ole hiki ia'u ke ho'i aku I mokoli'i. No ka mea, a ole hiki ia'u ke au.
Pane mai ka he'e na au palu palu.
A ole pilikia, hiki paha ia'u ke kokua aku ia oe. E pi'i a e oe I luna o ko'u po'o. A e ho'i aku au ia oe I kou home.
I ke kau ano ka iole maluna kona po'o, ua ho'omaka ka he'e e ho'i aku I mokoli'i. Ka nui o ko ka iole maka'u. Aka, ka hea kula ka he'e.
E noho mali e oe, mai makau. Kama aina loa au I ke ia kai.
Ma hope iho, ua hiki kula lao I mokoli'i. Ua iho I hola ka iole, mai luna iho ko ka he e po'o. Aha e kula o ia iaia.
Ke mahalo nui aku ni au ia oe no kou lawe ana mai iau. Ai ke kahi makana nao ma luna o kou po'o.
A hola awiwi e kula ka iole I uka. Ua haha ela ka he e ma luna o kana po'o. A loa'a ke kukai. Ua ki'o ka iole ma luna ke po'o no ka mea maka'u loa o ia. Ka huhu nui o ka he'e. Mai kēlā manawa mai, I nā ike I ka leho e ka he'e, ua lālau o ia iaia no ka mea mana'o o ia o ka iole no ia. Hana ka po'e Pākipika I kekahi mea I kapa ia he lühe'e, me ka pōhaku a me ka leho. A loa'a ka he'e iā lākou me kēia mea.
Pipi holo ka ao.
Oi. Okay. So that wasn't too long. That was our video. Danny Yarbrough did the animation. Myself and two friends and colleagues did the voiceovers. Even though it's entirely in Olelo Hawaii, and even if you haven't learned any Hawaiian language yet, hopefully you can make some observations on what's important in this mo'olelo, what's important in this story, what's important in a Hawaiian worldview, just by the visuals, without necessarily understanding the language. So we saw land and ocean, we saw a ecological presence, we saw the he'e and iole, which is, of course, the biology of this place. The va'a, the canoe, that the he'e and, sorry, let me back up a second. He'e is the Hawaiian word for squid or octopus. Iole is the Hawaiian word for rat. So this is the story about the squid and the rat. And the rat needs the va'a, the canoe, to go to across the channel. And the lure, the octopus lure at the very end, called the lühe'e, are good examples of indigenous innovation and technology. We also heard place names written into the script, so there's a bit of geography going on. It tells us how we have this lühe'e, how the octopus lure came into existence. So there's ontology and cosmogony happening as well. We see relationships between the he'e and the iole. So there's a sociological perspective happening as well, and the values and the ethics or the ethos. I'm not sure if that's entirely correct, but what's important in this mo'olelo is anything and everything that was actually included in it. And I think that fact easily gets overlooked in contexts of language documentation and conservation. If we're sort of reflexively asking ourselves what's important, it's sort of such an easy question to ask. It might be, it seems so easy, but it might just actually be simple, and easy and simple aren't always the same thing. So what I hope this animated video has shown is that together all of these knowledge systems constitute a language's worldview. In this case, this was a Hawaiian worldview. All worldviews are unique. Of course, that is where the diversity comes into play. A language's worldview is at the core of language documentation and conservation. And I think that's a very important message I hope you folks walk away with today from today's talk. So what I want us to start thinking about are when it comes to your own language, how is it diverse? How does it differ? How is it unique from another language? And one way we might begin to discover those differences and those how it's unique is how your language includes more words for less words in another language, how your language has very precise terms for maybe more general terms in another language, how it has very developed language to talk about certain things. And those certain things might be things like familial relations, taxonomies, that index certain knowledge systems, native plants and animals, technology, cultural, traditional, ecological knowledge, and different ways of knowing, which we might call epistemologies. All of these things are extremely important in language documentation conservation, and they're probably not the things that are getting written down in sketch grammars or dictionaries. Not all, at least not all the time. Those probably aren't the primary outsets for researchers at this point. Happy to say we're kind of changing the paradigm, but excuse me. So let's see. The first plant, native plant, which is also a tree, an entire tree in Hawaii, very unique to Hawaii, is the ohi'alehua. And I want to walk us through the different values that ohi'alehua has in, I guess, depending on the field of knowledge, depending on who you ask. How is ohi'alehua important? An ecologist is going to tell you, or give you one answer. A lay maker is going to give you a different answer. A linguist might give you a different answer. So, ecologically speaking, of course, this plant, this native plant, the ohi'alehua, has a Latin name through the traditions of the binomial nomenclature, Metrosideros macropis. Ecologically speaking, otherwise though, the name suggests that it has a root word in its name, ohi. And ohi in Olelo Hawaii means to gather. And the name ohi'alehua suggests that it gathers water. It is a ecologically valuable tree in its ability to retain groundwater. It's also ecologically important because it's the first tree to grow out of a new lava flow. If you've been to Hawaii, if you've been here long enough, you're sure to hear and maybe even see lava flow and the volcanic activity on the Big Island, on Hawaii Island, is still happening. And new flows periodically occur. And out of those new flows, the ohi'alehua tree grows rather quickly, especially if we're reminded that lava essentially destroys and then creates new life. And part of that new life is this ohi'alehua tree. And it's also important because it corresponds to a variety of kalo, or taro, which is a staple food for traditional diet in Polynesia, Hawaii included. And that variety of kalo is called lehua. But what about from a material culture perspective? What can we make with this ohi'alehua tree or leaves or blossoms? The wood is hardwood, used for canoes, used for umeke or bowls or other woodworking, other stuff for woodworking. The blossoms and the leaves are used in lei making, and it's also a very significant tree. The lehua is very significant in hula culture and history of hula. And let's see. From a folkloric or mythological perspective, there are dozens of mo'olelo or stories, traditional stories that feature the ohi'alehua, and they include the ohi'alehua in different, for its myriad symbolisms. It's symbolic of love, it's symbolic of female, it also has lots of sexual connotation and innuendo as well. In those contexts when it's used to symbolize love and love making and so forth. But just lehua by itself, the word lehua also has linguistic value in its polysemy. One meaning, one dimension of this word lehua is expert, swift, strong. Another is a warrior. or the first warrior to wage battle. Another meaning is a sweetheart, which ties back to the symbolism of it being a symbol of love. It's also a beloved friend or relative. It has other poetic references in the Hawaiian worldview. We can talk more about that if we have time later on. Another plant or tree that it's probably more likely you've seen this one on campus or walking around UH campus, walking around Hawaii. This one is a little bit more common to find. The kukui tree. The Latin name is listed here. Ecologically, it's very tall and pretty durable. It's a very strong tree. It provides a lot of canopy shade for in the forest and so forth. Culturally speaking, it's also very important. We can use the softwood for canoes. The sap and the bark of the kukui are used in dyes, making dye, making kapa or bark cloth. The sap is also sticky enough to be used as a certain gum or a glue that can be used as a glue. The nuts are used very versatilely. They're chewed for fishing to make the ocean calm when you're fishing with a certain type of net for a certain type of fish. They're also used in lei making. I'm sure many of us have seen what a kukui nut lei looks like. They're pretty easy to find. And also the nuts are used to make a relish called inamona, or a condiment that's pretty delicious. If you've had poke, you've probably had inamona on top. Mythologically speaking, the kukui is a kinolau, or a bodily form of a deity, an akua named Kamapua'a, who sort of in the pantheon of Hawaiian deities. Kamapua'a is kind of the trickster. He's famous and infamous at the same time for being sort of squirrely and rascal. And pua'a, or pua'a, is the Hawaiian term for pigs or hogs or boars. They eat the kukui nut. And it's also a kinolau of Kamapua'a, the pig god, the pig demigod, because of because of how the leaf looks. The leaf of the kukui is said to represent the snout and ears of a pua'a. So if you look at this leaf and you're looking straight at the head of a boar, you might see the outline. I put pictures next to it. I put these pictures so we could see. You can kind of see the face, snout, and ears of a pig when you're looking at a kukui leaf. Again, these are things that you probably won't find in the dictionary, or when a language is being documented. These are not at the forefront of most researchers' heads, but we also want to make sure that really thorough language documentation is going to take these kinds of knowledges into account. It's important to know that kukui, linguistically, in Olelo Hawaii also means lamp or light or torch. Therefore, it has a figurative meaning for someone who is a leader or a guide. It's also a symbol of enlightenment and wisdom. And it also has certain cultural interpretations. The malu kukui, or the kukui shade. If you come from the malu kukui, you're said to have questionable genealogy, which is an interesting tidbit. It might seem like trivial knowledge, but all of these really add up and constitute an epistemology and a culture and a worldview that's encapsulated in the language. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is a native Hawaiian manu, or a Hawaiian bird, specifically a shorebird, coastal bird. called the Eva. I'll probably come back to the ecological value of the Eva, but it's a native shorebird. It eats food of other birds. What other birds have already eaten, it eats that food by forcing other birds to basically disgorge their food. So, kind of at the top of the food chain in terms of birds. Material culture, the Eva has value in terms of its feathers, which are used as gifts for the symbolism that they have, that Eva have. You might also use feathers in lei. In traditionally, not just flowers or foliage are used to make lei in Hawaii. We also use bird feathers. If you're not making a lei, you might make a kahili, which is a feather standard, and it's an emblem of royalty. Eva are also celebrated as navigational aids for sailing, canoe sailing. Follow the Eva. They're also a pretty popular tattoo motif and a motif in other designs. And the Eva bird corresponds to also the Eva fern, based on the sharing of the name Eva. Eva are also symbolic of attractive people. An attractive person is likened to an Eva because of the way they can glide for hours without ever flapping their wings. They just ride the wind. Back to one of the meanings of an Eva. It's gained this meaning. One of the meanings of Eva is because it basically steals food. So an Eva has come to mean figuratively a thief or thievery. In creation chats, the Eva is also the parent to the koa'e, which is another shorebird, I believe pictured here. Linguistically speaking, the Eva has value in certain turns of phrases and popular colloquialisms in Olelo, Hawaii. Ki kaha ka Eva means the Eva is gliding, and that's how you might compliment somebody's attractiveness or their beauty. Eva is also often replaced with Eva. Without this okina, without this glottal stop here, the Eva and the Eva without the okina means the numeral 9. It is also part of Kamehameha, the king of Hawaii, the first king of the entire archipelago of Hawaii. Kamehameha had in one of his names Ka'iva Kilo Moku, which means the island snatching Eva. The Eva that snatches islands. That was one of Kamehameha's names. So all of these things are important to Hawaiians, culturally speaking, historically speaking. They had and they still have value, and these are the kinds of things that language documentation and conservation could tremendously benefit if these kinds of knowledges are included in that project. I must acknowledge the fact that not all knowledge should be documented. We have to acknowledge the fact that some knowledge is sacred or sanctified to the point where it's inappropriate to be shared publicly. Some forms of knowledge are sacred and not meant to be shared publicly, and that's okay. I want to make it clear that that's okay as well. But I do want to pose the question, what are some solutions to make sure that this knowledge is passed on in appropriate ways as we strive to document and conserve languages and the knowledges that they encode? If some knowledge is only meant to be privy to certain people, how can we kind of do, how can we have the foresight to make sure that those knowledges are passed on appropriately? So the last thing I want to talk about before we kind of, before I open up maybe some discussion or Q&A time is this kuleana, this word kuleana and this cultural concept known as kuleana. If you've been in Hawaii long enough, you've probably heard this. It's one of the few Hawaiian words that most people in Hawaii, most locals, Hawaiian or not, they know this word. Sometimes news stations, journalists, reporters will use this Hawaiian word without translating it into English. And it's a pretty unique cultural concept to Hawaii, but it is, as you can see, packed with all kinds of meaning. Kuleana means right, privilege, concern, responsibility, title, business, property, estate, and so on. So it is packed with meaning in a way that is very difficult to define in a single word. But kuleana is this idea of something that you have a responsibility to. I just realized this arrow should be pointing up. This arrow is not pointing the right way, but it's a reciprocal, sort of cyclical kind of occurrence that whatever you have a responsibility towards or to, you also benefit from the privileges that come from that responsibility. And if you have if you benefit from the privilege of something, you also should be actively showing and pledging a responsibility to that privilege. So it is an ongoing relationship. Kuleana is an ongoing relationship between something that you have to do, but also something that benefits your life. It's an ongoing relationship something that benefits your life, and you have a responsibility towards it. So I want to use that idea to frame these next questions that I ask you folks, whether you're in Hawaii nei, zooming in from the continental United States, zooming in from someplace else internationally, where I'm overjoyed to have you folks join us today. And these are the questions I have for you folks. What is your kuleana, or your responsibility and privilege, to your language? What is your kuleana to your culture? Also, what is your kuleana to your role as an LDTC participant? So these two questions are mainly for those who are joining us in LDTC with knowledge of a language that we're interested in documenting. What is your kuleana to your language, to your culture, and to your role as a participant in LDTC? And if you are joining LDTC more as a researcher or a linguist, then these questions are for you. What is the researcher's kuleana to another's language or another's culture? Also, what is the researcher's kuleana to the native speaker? I want us to start thinking about these relationships, and a lot of times nowadays we hear about reciprocity and that kind of ongoing relationship, the relationship building and the relationship maintenance, I suppose, as it were. And I'm framing those questions in this using this cultural concept of kuleana. And how can we start to think about our kuleana to our language, the languages that we speak, the languages that we hope to document and conserve, and help endure indefinitely into the future. Sort of our long-term kuleana and more short-term kuleana. What do we have? What are kuleana to each other as researchers, linguists, native speakers, native informants, and this great project that has brought us all together, Language Documentation Training Center. LDTC. So I think that's about my time. These are a really quick bibliography, nothing too intense. But let's see. If I exit this, I go here. Okay. What should we do now? So if you folks have any, Manao, if you have any thoughts, feedback, insight, opinions, beliefs, questions, absolutely feel free to put them in the chat. I don't hesitate to say if this was in person, it would absolutely be discussion time. So I want us to discuss. Ooh, Anna's telling me I should open my webcam program. Webcam, like just, let me see. Anna, I'm gonna text you back. Like, what is that? Photo booth? Oh, I'm scrolling down. Got it. I hadn't scrolled down. Hercules, I see a question from you 11 minutes ago. I think Anna answered it. This tree called the kukui tree. Anna, that's a good idea. I'm going to open, where's photo booth? Oh, that's kind of cool. I guess you guys can see me like that. Okay, let's get to some other questions. Anna, or maybe Zach or Shirley, did you folks were you able to kind of field any of the questions? Let's see. Hercules, I see you asked the question, and I think Anna's going to relay it to me. Eduardo, I like your point about the research. The researcher is supposed to show all the willingness to promote a culture of conservation within the community in which he or she is conducting the documentation process. Yeah, absolutely, sure. Okay. Hercules wants to know if there's a term for the metaphorical mapping of plants to animals. It's a really good question. Not all deities, well, I shouldn't say that. How should I answer this? I think the word you're looking for might be the word I introduced later, kinolau. Kinolau is the Hawaiian word for physical form, particularly physical form of a deity. And that sort of the correlation of Kamapua'a, the demigod, the half pig, half man demigod in Hawaii, having the form of a kukui nut kukui leaf because of the similar features physically. That's kind of a one-off, kind of a coincidence maybe. There are other body parts of akua, of deities, that are represented by plants. But that one is sort of the most kind of obvious and neat in a way that is, a useful example. But it's a good question, very good question. Emma, I saw your question about suggestions on where we can learn more about native plants. Yeah, I can think of a few resources on through Voyager, through the library systems, that I can look for and share with you folks in the chat or later on. Let me see, what else? Yumi, it's a good question. What do you feel as a Kanaka Maoli should be the kuleana of people outside of the Lahui participating in language culture of Olelo, Hawaii? I think everyone benefits from anyone learning Hawaiian from the get-go, from the very beginning. The revitalization of Olelo, Hawaii has never been race-based, and I think that is something that I think that's a reason for its success. Now, that's not to say that race and Hawaiian blood and blood quantum don't play a role. They absolutely do. But I think acknowledging your position, if you're outside of the Lahui, meaning you don't have, you're not Hawaiian by blood, if you're not racially Hawaiian, I don't think you absolutely have a place in the revival and the reclamation of language and culture. But I think positionality is going to be important, meaning acknowledging that fact, acknowledging your relationship to the Hawaiian people. And of course, in honest and earnest, frank ways. Yeah. Let's see. Anna has a question about methods. What's a good way to get started on exploring the links between language, plants, and animals, values, and worldview? How do we start exploring that? Nature walks are a great way, with maybe a good tour guide. When we're talking about traditional ecological knowledge, we sort of should maybe start talking about localized knowledge. Localized is not always traditional knowledge, but local knowledge does have value. The idea of traveling and getting to know the locals, that's a pretty popular idea. But it's a really good methods question, Anna. How do we start seeing those connections between worldviews and cultural values, cultural norms, and how they're represented in the language and the material culture and the biology of a place? I'm not sure how to answer that. I think it's an emerging, maybe not an entire field, but at least a subfield, and maybe even an emerging methodology. I know that, what's the word I'm looking for? Ethnography really strives to do that. Ethnographic research strives to do that. But that's a great question. Getting started exploring the links. Because like I said earlier, that those factoids, I guess, for lack of a better word, those factoids that I shared relevant to the 2 plants and the 1 bird that we looked at today, those aren't going to be, a lot of that stuff isn't in dictionaries or, like I said before, where do you find that information? It's a sort of I think a valid and helpful methodology to sort of synthesize all of that knowledge, and the result is it might be less linguistic, or linguistically, the end product might be less linguistically, but that's not to say it's any less valuable. Krishna, indigenous knowledge is to be documented. It can be included in lexical analysis as a note. Similarly, it can be included in a tier of text analysis. We have done it in documentation of an endangered language and found that it is really useful. Great, yeah. I think metadata has a lot of possibility. Metadata has promise to be the space where a lot of that is documented. I think what I would say about metadata versus actual data is metadata can kind of be marginalized sometimes, and at least in the tradition of inquiry in linguistics, that these facts that I shared today aren't again, they're not the first priority of a lot of researchers and research projects. So they end up sort of relegated in the metadata, and that's maybe not always the best thing. So, okay, let's see. Cool. I'm reading you folks' comments. Anna, that book that you found, the Hi'iakaikapoliopele story, probably the most epic and epically important story in the Hawaiian repertoire. It's been translated into English, so it's available in Hawaiian and English. And it's a beautiful story. The thing is, those books are sort of hard to come by. They're expensive, but there's different versions and shortened versions of that story that are pretty readily available. And yeah, that's a great start to see the interconnectedness of not just language and culture in Hawaii, but everything else we talked about: the biology, the ecology, the geography, the technology, the cultural norms and values. All of those things really tie up in a really beautifully poetic way. And one example of that interconnectedness is this story that you shared, Hi'iakaikapoliopele. Let's see, I'm interested in deities of the Ayatol language in the Philippines. The problem is that the tribe might not cooperate with me if they deem it as sacred. Bema, I think that's a valid concern. Yeah, absolutely. Folks might be, if this is their life, and this is their history, and this is their existence, and their existence is of course it's it's sacred, and their religion is sacred, and their deities are sacred. There might be some hesitation in asking to document that knowledge, absolutely, but it would be a shame if that knowledge was lost. So that's why I posed the question earlier. Can we, is there a way to talk about these things appropriately and ensure their documentation and practice in appropriate ways by appropriate people? Maybe Bema, maybe what you can do is figure out how you can help people who actually speak that language, who actually practice that religion, who actually have that knowledge. Maybe what you could be is a facilitator in that documentation process, or figure out ways to, however you can help. you know, and maybe you don't define how you help, you don't define your role yourself. Maybe the community defines your role for you. And that's a difficult question. Yeah. Let's see, anything else coming in? I think that's all the questions I see. Anna, Shirley, or Zach, if you folks see any other questions that I might have missed, then feel free to repost them or relay them to me. I'm just seeing your response as well, Anna. Your kuleana as an outsider is not to pry or pressure anyone to share or transmit their knowledge. But yeah, absolutely. It's difficult to see knowledge is being lost. And yeah. We can include the indigenous knowledge in terms of texts like economic cycle, ritual cycle, etc. We included a number of texts that include the indigenous knowledge. Good. That sounds very thorough. Sounds like thorough documentation. Good to know, Krishna. Okay, so I don't see any more questions coming in. Anna, I'm gonna sort of check with you what we should do now. Oh, here's a question. Robbie is asking, what about indigenous biology? That's always an interesting question, especially for the case of Hawaii. I don't know if you folks have traveled here to Hawaii, but if you have, and then maybe traveled to Aotearoa, New Zealand as well, you will have noticed that the protocols for welcoming in planes coming from international places the protocols are a lot stricter than planes welcoming passengers to Hawaii. It's pretty easy to get into Hawaii, meaning the planes aren't really, they're not sprayed down. The kind of measures to prevent invasive species are not as nearly as strict as going to other places, like Aotearoa, I said earlier. So what we're left with is a whole lot of invasive species, biologically speaking, in Hawaii that are threatening. I'm not sure if you folks know, but Hawaii is always pretty much, it ranks very high. Hawaii ranks very highly on the endangered species list in terms of flora and fauna, both. So indigenous biology is important, but what the government is doing to protect indigenous plants and indigenous biology, in my opinion, is not enough. They don't seem to take it very seriously. This is a gigantic, hugely important issue if we're talking about ecology and traditional ecological knowledge. In this way, the ecology of Hawaii is very threatened and has been for a long time. It's been for a long time. So I'm not sure how to affect positive change in that vein, but I absolutely think it's overdue. Yumi, we have some more Mo'olelo Oiwi on the way. They just haven't been finalized and published, but there are some published by Kamehameha School of Publishing. Office of Hawaiian Affairs has done some as well. let me just type that into the chat real quick. KS, they both have, OEV TV has done some, Office of Hawaiian Affairs. I'm typing these names into the chat. All of these agencies have YouTube channels, I believe. I know that Kamehameha Schools Publishing and OHA does. And they have done some animated Mo'olelo OEV as well. Yeah, surely. Same thing. They inspect everything. We couldn't bring certain we couldn't bring any feathers. We had on our hula implements when we got to Aotearoa, we had lei made of native plants, and we had hula implements that were made of feathers, and they confiscated them. It was a tragedy for us, but in the greater scheme, you have to appreciate that kind of thoroughness in vetting who's able to come in and what's able to come in. Yeah. Okay. Anna has said that there's some kind of delay. I hope everybody can kind of hear me okay. But that seems like all the questions. And I will leave my email if you folks want to get in touch and discuss anything further. But yeah, what a fun afternoon for me. I don't think I used the functionality of Facebook Live to its full extent, but that's okay. Oh, we're back up to 25 views. Hi, mahalo ya oko. Thank you everybody for joining us. This was neat. I really wish we could speak in person or on Zoom at least, but if you folks want to reach out, absolutely feel free. Mahalo again to LDTC, Anna, Zach, and Shirley for organizing and sponsoring this. Mahalo to the linguistics department. And yeah, I'll see you folks next week. Cool. Enjoy your weekend. How cool is this? Like. Mahalo, you guys. Arizona, India. Really neat. Mahalo, Emma. Good morning from the Philippines. Okay, I'm going to end this live.